This is Untethered Layers with the Arc of E Network. I am Rachel Tyler.
And I am Dawood Rachel. What album are we talking about this week, Rachel?
Well, we're here today to talk about Y's album, Alopecia.
Okay, so I didn't really lay out how the show would be last week, so I'll give you guys a quick little structure. Generally, what I do is I'll come and talk shop a little bit about the history of the album and the context of like where they were at. And then Rachel says like all the really smart, articulate shit about about how the songs sound, and then I kind of just piggyback off that. And then at the end we talk a little bit about a couple of our favorite tracks. But with this album in particular, I feel like we're just gonna end up talking about every single track.
Most of them at least.
There are some we were just chatting that don't stand out as strongly to us, but that doesn't mean that we don't love them all the same. So I'll go ahead and just, like I said, give some context to where the album is. This Alopecia, the Alopecia LP came out in 2008, which now is a perfect time, I think, to be talking about this album because, they're coming up 10-year anniversary. I think it was back in either March or April, something like that.
It came out in March, yeah.
In March, yeah. So 10 years ago, as of this past March, Alopecia is, I feel like I can comfortably say, the quintessential Y album. Would you agree? Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, like we said last week, most Y fans become a fan through this album, at least once our age, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. And we mentioned last week about how some of the older generation Y fans got in on an elephant eyelash and were able to anticipate Alopecia. But for some of us who were toddlers at the time, we didn't have the luxury to get in on that ground level. But yeah, so it came out in 2008, and we talked last week about Elephant Eyelash being the big move from Yoni's solo stuff to a full band thing. This definitely isn't nearly as much of a dramatic shift, but they did have a different. They had a shift in their sound. They kind of tossed away their unconventional samplers and instruments. They kind of rid those in favor of some more traditional instruments, like a guitar, a bass, a drums, and a keyboard. But they still managed, despite the fact that they had, a generic lineup for a band, probably one of the most distinguishable sounds that Y has cultivated, in all of their, at least all the albums we're going to talk about, from Elephant Eyelash to Mochlin. Something that I would equate this, at least the instrumentation of this record, to imagine if imagine a man with a really heavy southern drawl turned into a guitar or a bass, because it's very deep and kind of slow and really heavy. Throughout most of the album, not all of it. But I definitely think one of the most distinct sounds that they've cultivated, kind of lower register, his vocals for sure are very monotonous, which I think is pretty indicative of how he was feeling and where his head was at the time. Because back in 2008, was the start of Yoni's chronic illness. I don't really know a whole bunch about it. I mean, that's something super personal that I'll let him keep. But back in 2008 was whenever he found out that he had Crohn's disease. So it was the start, in his own words, it was the start of some real rough stuff. He also got mumps in 2008, which sneak peek to the one of the later albums, Mumps, etc. But yeah, so he had started to, I don't know, develop Crohn's. I assume that's how it happened.
It started experiencing symptoms of it.
Yeah. And actually, one of the tracks we're going to talk about later, a shared favorite between Rachel and I, called By Torpedo or Crohn's, was written and I believe named before he even knew he had Crohn's, which is, I don't want to say funny because it's a horrible
it's
experience.
Ironic.
Yeah, ironic. But yeah, so this was all the beginning of his chronic illness, some real rough stuff, and it clearly shows in a lot of the songs. There's some more hopeful songs, but a lot of this album is sort of nihilistic, sort of dark.
I mean, just going on in terms of the themes, Elephant Eyelash does deal with some pretty dark, heavy stuff. Especially, we didn't really get to talk about Act 5 or Light Leaves very much, but those are some very dark songs, and really an interesting transition into this really abruptly dark. I just don't know how else to say.
It's just really
heavy and dark this album is.
You put it in a really particular way whenever we were talking about it last week. You said something. You called this album an exorcism. I want you to talk a little bit more about that, because I could not think of a better word to define this album, other because I remember talking about Elephant Eyelash and how it's just they took their sound, or he took his sound from earlier and sort of refined it into a full band sound. And it was an album that was really, really cool to make. But you and I talked about how Alopecia seems like an album that Yoni needed to make for himself. So I think Exorcism, and you last week you said it was aggressively personal. I think those are two like incredible ways, not to put you like on blast or anything that, no. But two incredible ways to just sort of define this album as a whole. I read this quote that was in a review of the album, and it said that it was like 5 a.m. journal entries cut up and turned to collage, which I thought was a really interesting way to put it, because I definitely agree. And throughout songwriting, I at least different people that I've heard talk, and I've read different things. There are really two like main types of songwriting, where you sit down and you write down a song like from start to finish, or you take bits and pieces that share similar themes and kind of just stitch them up into one song. And I feel like most of this album is taking like really interesting, like they said, journal entries, or like really quick, dark, deep thoughts, and kind of jotting them down and then coming together and putting them all in one cohesive way.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'll say, I think you and I are both pretty creative people, and this album
not
definitely.
To brag or anything.
Yeah,
no, I know.
And just listening to this album, you can tell that he, like I said, that he had to make it as a way of coping with something that was happening. Some things that we're aware of, some things we'll probably never be aware of that were going on with him and maybe with some of the other members of the band at that time in their lives.
I'll say that one of my favorite things about Yoni as a whole, and this album in particular, is like you just mentioned, that there are some parts that we know about, that were public. He had Crohn's disease, or he was going through this, he was going through that, whatever. Some parts that you can kind of infer what was going on, very specific events. I threw up in a Whole Foods parking lot kind of thing.
Today after lunch, I got sick and blue chunks all over my new shoes and a lot behind Whole Foods. This is a new kind of blues.
But one of my favorite things about his songwriting is that, try as you may, there are some lyrics that will never mean literally anything to anyone except for him.
Exactly.
Which is like one of my personal. I kind of sometimes see listening to songs as kind of like a treasure hunt, like kind of stitching together clues from this album or like a couple albums back, and kind of being like, oh, these two match up. What does that mean? Like, there's a line in this album that harkens back to something that he did back in his Cloud Dead era. We'll talk about that later, because it's in one of the tracks I'm going to talk about. But yeah, just like a lot of his music and a lot of his songwriting is just, like you said, so deeply personal that I won't ever have any idea what was going through or what he meant by this certain line, or who he was talking about or where he was, kind of thing.
Yeah, and something that last week you kind of were mentioning how you felt like you were a little bit too young to be listening to this album because of the really adult, dark themes that are on it. And I disagree, because I think that clearly like we said, it was a very cathartic like release. He had to do this to get through something, and I think that that's what young people really go through. And I think we, as we're entering adulthood, you and I and other adults in general, are really dismissive of young people's pain, because I'm forgetting what it was like to be 13.
Yeah.
At this point.
Thankfully.
Well, yeah. Exactly. It's at that point in your life, you've never hurt more.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important to have, music, and why music or pop culture in general is so important for people at that young age who are just starting to go through really difficult things. And even people at a younger age, I think, again, it is a little explicit for people who are, in single digits. But I think that, 13 years old almost makes perfect sense for an album that's so dark.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with the fact that the middle school is just in general the worst time of, I think, anybody's life. So many like, this has nothing to do with the album, but my personal experience or my context with the album, it's just the shittiest, worst, like, I don't know how people do it, dude. How does anybody like experience being 13? for some people listening to this, that may have seemed like a lifetime ago. It sure as shit seems like a lifetime ago to me. I'm 21, you're 22, yeah. But yeah, I guess I can kind of see that being a little bit more not relatable, but kind of something that you might need at that time.
Mm-hmm. Even if you can't actually relate to the things that he's going through.
The exact things that he's talking about. But I also wanted to talk about the sort of how this album goes up against the other albums, at least thematically. Like stylistically and instrumentally, you can definitely tell like a huge shift. But in Elephant Eyelash, there were a lot of, like you said, there were a lot of deeply personal things in that record. It's been like cited as a breakup record, like throughout time. But I think this is definitely one of the, like we said, darkest and one of the most aggressively personal albums that he's ever put out in between any side projects or between anything, which is why I think it's like the quintessential Why album. Like if you want to if you want to like and understand Why, like this is the album that
it's so raw. Exactly, there's no way for you to not feel something while listening to it.
And like at least thematically compared to some of the later albums, I was talking to you earlier about how the themes in this album pair up with a lot of the themes in like Mumps, but in such a different way. Like in Alopecia, there's like this uncertainty, and he's kind of like, everything is shit, it's the worst. He talks a lot about death in this record. He says, what did he say about I'll be okay, cool as a rail.
If I'm not raw, I'm just a bit underdone, but I'd be okay, cool as a rail, if they just let us have health, food, and hell.
There's a certain like, he doesn't give a shit anymore. Like it's like he's given up basically. And I can understand that, it's at the beginning of all this really, really dark shit, all this really horrible stuff that's happening to him, traumatic, even just health wise. So it's super easy to get lost in like this dark ocean of nihilism. But there's this uncertainty and an unwillingness to kind of figure it out, or an unwillingness to kind of just like accept. But in like Mumps, he still talks about the same shit. He still talks about the same illnesses. He still talks about whatever, but he's kind of like in a more he's doing it in a happier way. He's kind of just not, I wouldn't say necessarily happy, but more fun way.
Yeah.
I like I said in Alopecia, he was kind of just it was really dark and he didn't give a shit anymore. But in Mumps, he's like, yeah, everything sucks, but like here's this super funny pun I'm gonna make out of like this horrible thing that happened to me. And then in Mohlin, he's still filled with that same uncertainty. He has no idea. Like I would venture to say, I don't want to speak for Yoni, but he's a lot happier in his Mohlin times than he was in his Alopecia times. But there, there's still that same uncertainty where he talks a lot about religion. He talks a lot about, like where he is in the universe kind of thing. But in a more hopeful way. He's like, I don't understand anything, but that's okay, because like I can still move on, or like I don't really need to understand anything. I can kind of just go with the flow.
When we get to Moline, we'll talk more about how much like a birth that album feels, at least to me.
Yeah.
Or even, how birth and death are so close together, whereas Alopecia is so focused on death and an end of some kind, and just how can I move forward, how can I get past this, what is next, whereas Moline feels like the end of something, but also the beginning of something.
Yeah, and this was something that I talked to you and your sister about. We were really anticipating this album a lot. Like we were ready for it.
The Moline album.
Yeah. And how I was kind of scared because the way that he talks about a lot of stuff, or at least just how the album sounds and feels, it feels like a finale, like a last album, like a. So I genuinely thought like
this was
like last. I had no other indication, like they hadn't announced that they were splitting, or they hadn't announced they were going to stop making music, but just like listening to all the songs. And I don't want to get too into Moline because we'll talk about it in depth in a future episode. But me being scared, like shit, like
is this the end?
Yeah. What if Yoni like doesn't ever have any sort of like catharsis? He was like, man, I figured it all out. He's like, I don't have anything else to write about.
I don't have to write anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. But. Yeah, so just going back to Alopecia a little bit. The track list of Alopecia for me is super interesting, at least the way that a lot of them sound, because this is my own like probably a personal fault, but I tried too hard, I think, to attribute a lot of different Alopecia tracks to different eras of Why, and being like, this one sounds better. This album, this one sounds better. Obviously, the albums all stand incredibly by themselves. Like this is no like I'm not trying to do any disservice to any of the track list or whatever, but something super interesting to me is that despite the fact that he's going through so much in the alopecia area, despite the fact that he's, this is definitely the darkest album he's ever put out, it's punctuated by tracks that sound a little bit more hopeful, that sound like they might belong in the Elephant Eyelash area. Fatalist Palmistry being one of them. We talked about that a little bit earlier. About how I think it more maybe not belongs, but I think it more closely resembles a lot of stuff in Elephant Eyelash. But it does do wonders in the track list for Alopecia.
But I am still alive and loving, wide-eyed in my time. Not a mummy shrinking in its claws. Your cat clawed out my eyes while I was distracted by your smile.
Yeah, I mean, there are some of those albums that I think you just can't change the track list. You can't add a song, you can't subtract a song. I think this album is, I don't want to say it's perfect. This is pretty we're pretty biased already, but
it is perfect. Objectively, it is the greatest album that has ever come out of all time.
It's just really strong.
No, I definitely agree. It's something I was saying earlier is like whenever we were talking earlier, something that I try to do too much, I think, is try to form one cohesive thread, either lyrically or instrumentally or thematically through an album, but I don't think that necessarily has to be true for every album. And I think in some ways, at least thematically, Alopecia stands really strong as, really dark and about death. And like you said about it being something that he needed to do, it was cathartic. And apparently it was so cathartic that it spawned two albums from this. I don't know. Just like a little throwaway fact, I guess, is that during this time was whenever he recorded, or at least he wrote, I don't know if he recorded the entirety of Eskimo Snow as well, which is still to this day so bonkers to me because the album sounds so much different to me. Like the idea that he was going through the same shit and during both of these albums and writing during this time, both of these albums is insane to me.
Eskimo Snow and Alopecia sound so different.
Incredibly different. And the fact that they were written in the same session is
I really didn't believe you the first time I heard that.
Actually, this is all a joke. I was lying to you the entire time. So it is, that is one of the most intriguing Y facts to me is the fact that this and Alopecia and Eskimo Snow were written at the same time. Because I don't know if it's because Eskimo Snow... And, okay, so you were talking earlier about Eskimo Snow sounding like a collection of reject songs.
Yeah, and that's a very harsh way to put it.
I'm putting you on blast.
I love Eskimo Snow. Yeah. I think that I think that album gets forgotten a lot by Y fans, and it's not one that people really go to a lot. I really love it. But yeah, there's something about all the songs that I think they go together all right, but it just blows my mind that they were from the same session. I
think with a lot of the tracks, and like you said, I don't think you said reject. But a bunch of songs that maybe at the time and once again, I don't want to speak. I'm just gonna start saying it. The disclaimer: I'm not trying to speak for Yoni ever, but I think he knew the sort of theme, and I think he knew the sound that he was going for and I think he knew a lot of the Eskimo Snow songs didn't fit that sound. Even if he was feeling those feelings at the exact same time.
Even if they were great songs, they just didn't quite fit that album at this time.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful for that because Alopecia holds together so strongly as a piece of art, as one unit. So I'm glad that it wasn't, like he tried to pick the best out of all the songs and made it into one album.
Either album because both are.
Yeah, and I think Eskimo Snow also, not to do that any disservice, I think Eskimo Snow puts itself as a really strong unit as well.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier a lot of the tracks maybe sound a little bit different on Eskimo Snow throughout the album, but I think still thematically and I think still melodically at least, it flows really well as an album. And something else that I mentioned, we mentioned at the beginning that Alopecia is like the quintessential Y album. And something that I realized is that like it falls in line with the idea of a cult classic. it falls in line with the idea that it has, I think you mentioned, or we said,
a lot of people in the general public don't know why.
Yeah.
But the people who do know why, this album is probably one of their favorite albums.
Yeah, by far, and I mean, for obvious reasons.
The fan base for why, and for this album in particular, is so strong and extreme. That
it's got a very small and dedicated fan base.
Dedicated. And that's the definition of a cult classic.
Yeah, and I think to this day, like anybody who is interested in any realm of this kind of music, even though it's not really possible to pin why down into one particular genre or realm, knows and appreciates Alopecia. I literally cannot say this enough, that it is like, objectively, this album is what skyrocketed relatively why to the level of fame that they have now. Like you said, they're not top 100 on every album that they come out with, but more people know why. The amount of people that know why because of Alopecia.
Exactly.
And I think that just that in itself speaks into how strong of an album this is. But just talking about the context of it doesn't really do it justice. You want to talk about some tracks? Do you want to talk about our favorite tracks?
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's do it. I want you to start again.
Okay.
Give me time to think of really interesting things to say while you say smarter things.
I think even though this wasn't a track that either of us picked to talk about, I do want to talk about the first song.
Okay. And I will say that before we start recording, Rachel and I pick a couple tracks between, like, we'll pick a couple tracks each, and we'll say, I want to talk about this one particularly. We fought a little bit on this one because I want to have us pick different tracks, but we both picked at least one of the same tracks, if not two.
Yeah.
And with, like I said last week, I have an infinite amount of words for this album, and I can almost guarantee we're going to end up talking about the rest of the record throughout this segment. But there were two that I really wanted to talk about. That one of them being one that Rachel wanted to talk about as well. So we compromised, and we were both just going to talk a shit ton about it. I think is what we ended up doing.
Okay. Well, like I said, I think really quickly, I just wanted to start off with the first song on the album, which is the Vows Part 2, and comparing this to how we talked about the beginning of Elephant Eyelash with Crushed Bones, having that really, interesting drum pattern, that kind of, that kind of. Kind of eases you into it. Whereas the Vows Part 2 starts off with that really heavy, like dun dun dun. Like I'm not a musician, so don't. I shouldn't even try to. Stop. I shouldn't even try to imitate the songs, but I'm sure you can just put in the clip of it right there. But this album starts off immediately darker. You can tell. And you can tell it's just a heavier, rounder sound. And, what's even the first lyric?
I'm not a lady. No, that's...
that's it, isn't it? Yeah, no, that's it.
I'm not a ladies' man, I'm a landmine, filming my own fake death. Under an 88 Cavalier I go.
Kind of what we were saying, just this album starts off with such a heavy, dark song that you immediately know you're in for something different than Elephant Eyelash, alerting the audience of how different this album is.
Yeah, I think that song plays well into what we said about Crushed Bones last week, about how it's like, oh, so this is what it's going to sound like this time around. Like, I can't imagine. We talked last week about how we were fans of Alopecia as a younger generation, but older YA fans had the
anticipation,
had the pleasure of anticipating this
and
album,
not knowing what it was,
and not knowing what it was going to. I
can't imagine
listening to Elephant Eyelash and it being like, say it's your favorite album of the past couple years. Alopecia came out 3 years after Elephant Eyelash did, and being like, oh, fuck yeah, the new Y record's going to come out. I can't wait to, like, I have a pretty general idea, I think, of what it's going to sound like. And then Yoni just kind of, like, fucking kicks in the door with, like, a beer in his hand. He's like, we're going to talk about some real shit this time. And, yeah, it's just so just so personal, so dark. We keep going back to those two words, but because those are the two most
descriptive words
exactly
to say what this album is about.
What this album feels like. And like I said earlier, it feels punctuated by tracks that belong in older eras, but he also still he still gives credit to his past. Like he name drops Nos Dom. Dos has a backing vocals in the Hollows.
In the Hollows, yeah.
There's a line that he has that I mentioned earlier that I'll talk about in the Fall of Mr. Fifths, that he mentions the exact same scenario in an Old Cloud Dead production. It still definitely is strong in the idea of the discography and the history and the lineage of Y, but in itself, it's just so different and so strong. Like I said I have infinite words for this album, but I think it's too many. Like I can't comprehend.
I was really nervous coming into this because last week we were saying, I can't wait to talk about alopecia, but the more I think about it, the harder it is
to describe,
to really put it into words. Because
but fuck that, because this is our job. We're gonna help.
Right.
Yeah, we're gonna describe the shit out of this album, and I think by doing that, let's go back to talking about your other favorite track.
Right. Well, the Vows Part 2 transitions into
the absolute tastiest transition. Just
it's
the
such a
greatest thing and this is just a fun fact for me that I've told you this before, is that I started listening to Alopecia about I think the year or a year after it came out.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because I said I got into it either right before or right after Eskimo Snow came out.
Okay.
So within a year and a half, I started listening to Alopecia, and I had never heard this transition until I met you and your sister. You guys were the ones that, because you guys had the record and we played the record.
Yeah, we had the CD in our car, but you would listen to it on shuffle.
Yeah, so that was my problem, is that, like I said last week, what I would do is I would just download an album from Mediafire or whatever, and then I would just have my entire Windows Media Player library, and I would just hit shuffle and be like, all right, I have the greatest taste in music ever, and like every song that's going to come on is going to be a banger. I never listened to albums from start to finish. That was a wild concept to me. And whenever I met you guys and you were like, oh, I love this part so much, and I was like, the end of the Vows? I was like, that's mean. And you're like, what? No, like and I was like, I have no idea what you're. And then I listened to it, and my body just like separated from myself as soon. And I'll put the transition in right here.
If you grew up with white boys who only look at black and Puerto Rican porno.
But it's like, it's just still to this day one of the most wonderful, one of the greatest transitions I've ever heard in any song before. And I still to this day can't believe that I did not know about it for like
several years.
So many years.
I can't believe that the Shuffle never had that song come after.
Yeah, well, I listen to a lot of music, not to brag.
Okay.
Yeah. I was a very cool 13-year-old.
Okay, anyway.
But after Vowels.
It's really, I think, hard to talk about the song Good Friday because of how much I love that song, and especially how much my sister, Diane, loves that song. That's her favorite Y song. And I don't really know how to explain why we love it so much because, again, we're not really big on lyrics immediately. Mm-hmm. We're just big on the sound, and the way a song makes us feel. And it's really hard to put that into words, why one song makes us feel a certain way and why another doesn't. But there's just something about the rhythm of Good Friday that is so satisfying and so... It really makes you want to just replay it over and over again.
You and I actually looked up because we were curious what the most streamed Y song was, and I almost threw your phone out the window because it wasn't Good Friday. Like, the idea that, to me, and I think most people would agree with me, Good Friday, Alopecia is the most quintessential Y album, and Good Friday is the most quintessential song on this record.
As far as I would consider it.
Yeah, and I would say as well. Yeah, it is, this track is, I think, one of the most clearly defining tracks that makes this album what it is. Sorry,
continue.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that probably The Hollows is one of their most popular. And when we did look up the streaming numbers on Spotify, The Vows Part 2 was one of the highest streams, which surprised me.
Mind, yeah.
But The Hollows is probably their most popular and well known, I would say. But I think Good Friday is one of their most popular within the fan to the fans.
Yeah. Good fun fact. Actually, The Hollows was the first Y song that either of us.
Both of us.
Ever
Yeah,
heard.
both of us heard the Hollows first.
Yeah. So I owe a lot to that track, but it's not one of the ones that I'm going to talk about. But finish talking about Good Friday. Yeah.
Well, I just have so many memories with this song. You know, Diane and I listening to this in the car, and you know, every time a new verse would start, we'd be excited because we'd be like, oh, it's not over yet. There's one more verse.
Yeah.
You know, even though we knew the song by heart.
Yeah.
You know, and now at this point, this album, you know, you and I both probably have listened to it so many times that it almost doesn't feel like you're listening to it anymore. We just, you know, we sing the lyrics and it just kind of goes in one ear and out the other.
Just
in
muscle
a way.
memory at this point.
Muscle memory. And I love that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I would give a lot to go back and hear this song for the first time.
That would be, I would give every single limb that I own.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
But yeah, just it fills you so deeply with an emotion. Like we talked about Gemini, just like giving you so many.
Such a swell of emotion.
Such a swell. So it and Elephant Eyelash being so nostalgic, so deeply like. No matter what memory you ascribe it to, it's a really strong one.
Yeah.
But Good Friday and Alopecia, but particularly Good Friday, fills you with, I would say, the same, if not more emotion, but just a different kind of, just like really.
It feels like regret. It feels like, nostalgia, but in a more uncomfortable way.
Yeah.
You know.
Like this is something that you didn't realize like you could feel almost. At least whenever I first listened to Good Friday. So personally, like when on a first listen, it's incredible. But even just in the context of the album and how it flows into that, I mentioned earlier how I think it's one of the most important ones on the album.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
it establishes the sound so directly, and it establishes his vocals. At least the vocals that I attribute to Alopecia really. That are so much different than Elephant Eyelash.
Yeah.
It's like you can tell that the weight of the world is on his shoulders. You can he's just monotonous. He's like mumble rapping. He's like it's just so much different than Elephant Eyelash.
Yeah.
He's monotonous. He's almost like you can tell you can't see him obviously because you're listening to the album. You can see there's like nothing behind his eyes whenever he's singing this stuff. At least to me. You know, I don't want to say that he's not filled with emotion.
I think it's very painful.
Yeah, I think it's just really hard to get through. So he's kind of just dejected. I think whenever he's singing, you know, whenever he says just literally any part of that song is just
yeah. Well, the very very end when he says "I'll see you when the sun sets east."
Don't forget me.
Which is of course the title of the
Noah
Brothers
and Gavin's podcast. Yeah. It's and they picked it as their namesake because, like I said, this is one of the most important.
It's such a strong
line and such a strong song. And I feel like that line in particular kind of harkens back a little bit to Elephant Eyelash. Not to keep trying to, you know, throw songs where they don't belong, but I'll see you when the sun sets east. You know, it's really romantic, but also just like, at least, so if that line had been in Elephant Eyelash, it would have sounded a lot sweeter. But it's depressing at the end of this.
It's really lonely and desperate.
Yeah.
But also a little bit angry and defiant in a way.
Yeah.
Again, it's the kind of line that you can think of someone that you would apply that to.
Exactly, yeah. And there's another one in this album. I don't think it's in any of the songs we're going to name, so I'll just say it, where he says, even though I haven't seen you in years.
Oh.
Even though I haven't seen you in years, yours is a funeral I'd fly to from anywhere.
Yours is a funeral I'd fly to from anywhere. That's what I was going to say. Was when I'll see you when the sun sets east, and that one you just said from These Few Presidents. Two lines of this album.
I would say as well. Yeah, just the two strongest. I think the ones that people
quote.
So okay, I'll add another one on this. Just since we're doing this,
Yeah.
This is our fun news segment where we talk about really specific lyrics. So I'll see you when the sun sets east.
Like yours.
Even though I haven't seen you in years, yours is a funeral I'd fly to from anywhere, and you're the only proper noun I need.
Will I look better or will I look the same? Rotting in hell, you're the only proper noun I need. Hurry.
God.
Those are, if I see anybody
Yes.
ever quote "why" in any context, those are the three lyrics that they can choose from, and that's all they're allowed to choose from. But just so I would say, just as poetic as his earlier albums, but like in a context that you can't really these three lines are, I think, some of the most important on the record, especially in the context of Yoni saying them.
And to me, they're a very unique way to put a universal feeling.
Yes.
Which is why people love this album.
Yeah, people take these
because people
lyrics
can relate to it.
I guarantee there is at least, I don't want to say it, I guarantee there are a shit ton of people who have one of these lyrics tattooed on their
somewhere,
body.
yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, those three lines are just, I think, some of the most important on the record. And two of them aren't even on songs that we're going to talk about, which is just goes to show how like strong every moment of this album is.
It's hard to pick songs to talk about. You should say
I'll talk about the one that Rachel and I didn't disagree on, or the one that we both of us didn't pick.
Oh yes, yeah.
One of the ones I want to talk about, and once again, I wanted to kind of go away from talking about Good Friday, at least personally, and the Hollows, because those are the most talked about songs, I think, for very good reason. They're incredible, and they really define the sound of this album. But one of the ones that I wanted to talk about, because of how it relates to the history of why and the history of Yoni, is The Fall of Mr. Fifths.
It's a really good one.
First of all, just it's definitely one of my favorites on the album. I was talking to you earlier about how it's one of the most satisfying songs to sing along to.
Yeah.
Because there's
once you get the lyrics.
And if you can say it in one breath,
I can't do it. I still can't do it.
Like every so often I'll be able to do it, and I'm like, man, today's gonna be a good day. But yeah, just The Fall of Mr. Fifths. Mr. Fifth being him. So one of the pseudonyms I talked about last week that he used to go under was Miss Ohio's Nameless. There's a song on the Sand Dollars EP by the same name. Incredible track. And unless I'm mistaken, Pony Fifths, Mr. Pony Fifths was another pseudonym that he used. I think around that same time, around the Miss Ohio's Nameless, or during his solo time. But in the context of this record, and in the context, like him, this is the fall of Mr. Fifths. This is him talking about like
the downfall of. This
is him talking about his downfall in one of the darkest times of his life, and just even outside of the lyrics, just if you just look at the title of the song and you understand the context of, he is Mr. Fifths. Obviously, he's talking about himself, but kind of almost burying that older or that younger version of himself. Like that was more, I would say, hopeful, more definitely more energetic, I would say, at least in the terms of the music he was putting out at that time versus, Alopecia. But this is the downfall of Mr. Fifths. He's really hammering the idea that like I'm, beaten down basically to the ground. But yeah, the entire song is just like a narrative, like a retelling of his descent basically into the slump that he's in at the time. That Alopecia came out, and
slumps, etc.
Okay, I have to leave the podcast now. But there's a line where he says, "This is the fall of Mr. Fifths." Like this entire album, you guys are witnessing me, like my descent. You guys are witnessing my downfall. And I think even just the title, the song is in itself, like I said, very satisfying to sing along to. It's got the sort of like breathy sing-song quality that a lot of his tracks do, that I think some of the most fun ones are. But just the title really stands out to me the most, because it is so clearly like, if you couldn't, he's basically just like, hey, by the way, if you didn't notice that like everything's shit right now, this line will, I can't get any clearer. This is the fall of Mr. Fifths. Like that's, I mean, the most I had to say. Like I said, in terms of lyrics, obviously there are some incredible ones throughout the track, but personally, my favorite part about the actual song is just singing along to it. It's just like, it's so much fun. And like I said, if I can get in one breath like that, I'll be like, oh, I did my good deed for the day. I did my cool thing for the day.
This is the fall of Mr. Fifths, forged for the hordes and the ladies and lords, set with fat chords in modern English. I know, there's nothing more appealing than the sound of high heels down the marble tile hallways of your district's one allotted city-funded Steiner school, bilingual or Montessori, followed by a single high-pitched scream, followed by breaking glass. But could your anger be mapped into an interpretive dance to a trip-hop track? Could it be bowed out on strings or strung into a pattern for a God's eye to bring to your alma mater's holiday fundraiser boutique thing?
Well, do we want to both talk about
The one we were going to talk about?
the one we both chose?
Yeah, we'll both talk about. We'll just kind of riff back and forth.
You
know, as we do.
Well, we both really, really love by Torpedo or Crohn's,
Mm-hmm.
which I would say Torpedo or Crohn's, Good Friday. Well, I don't want to name my favorites from every other album because then we'll be here for another 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But I would say By Torpedo or Crohn's has been my favorite for several years from this album and just in general. Again, kind of like Good Friday, I don't really know how to explain why. There's just something about the particular darkness of this song and just the way that it sounds, the melody of it and the trudging along of it, similar to the Fall of Mr. Fist kind of trudging, mumbling. There's just something about this one.
Yeah, and even like you said, going back to talking about Good Friday, these two tracks in particular, I think really define the sound and the theme and the mood
of the whole album.
Behind the entire album. Yeah, the same way that we talked about Gemini kind of sets the whole mood for Elephant Eyelash. Yeah. These two tracks, By Torpedo or Crohn's and Good Friday, do the exact same thing for Alopecia, just in a very much darker tone and a very much darker mood. I think this track, actually a lot of the tracks on Eskimo Snow, but this track in particular seems the most like confessional. Like, here's a laundry list of things that have happened in my life, and here's a laundry list of like ways that different experiences that I've had. Where he says, you know, I'm hiding from my friends in the bathroom at Thrift Town to write this tune down, you know, and it kind of gives the same feeling that today after lunch I got sick in blue chunks, and feeling the most confessional to me, being like, or just the most like straightforward, like I'm not trying to sugarcoat it, I'm not going to dumb it down.
Exactly. Because again, I don't want to keep comparing different albums, but there's something about Elephant Eyelash, say, or some of his earlier stuff, that is more, like you said, coded in a kind of poetry or art, I guess. But this one is just pure,
like straight up.
This is what's happening. I don't know how else to talk about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said earlier, a diary entry.
Yeah. So just like, I'm not gonna play around. I'm like, you know, like I talked last week about Elephant Eyelash being like, or Elephant Eyelash and some of his older stuff, and even some of his newer stuff, just being like abstract poetry put around, you know, beats or put around, you know, really interesting instrumentation. This is straight up like I'm reading off like an experience that I had in one day during this really dark time in my life. And Good Friday, you know, he's like mortaring your whole shut in a rush with White Coke. Just these really like visceral, these very particular vivid images of what's happening. Yeah. And this is like, I feel like one of the albums that you can get the clearest image of how Yoni was as a person, at least in this time, because you can see how he is in Oakland and Elephant Eyelash as a writer and the different ways he can express different feelings and stuff like that. But this is like, you get, I think, the clearest view into his day-to-day life or his own personal experiences in this album. Yeah. And I think in this song, this and Good Friday the most.
Yeah. Because, I mean, thinking again about certain lines that stick out to me from this album, from this song, is again, like, you know, throwing up, you know, like, in Good Friday, he talks a lot about, like, jerking off, you know, and what else? Like, doing coke, you know. Yeah. And then there's that line in, I think it's These Few Presents, where he says, my fingers, something about finger strangling.
Wow. Rocking the Chinese fingers grow. The machinery on your throat.
So just lines like that are so violent and so visceral. Vivid, yeah. It's really hard to ignore the extremity of these lyrics.
But yeah, before we get to like either start talking in circles or get too deep into By Torpedo or Crohn's, is there another track that you wanted to talk about?
Not specifically. I mean, again, I could really go into detail about any of these tracks. I think Simeon's Dilemma is one that has really grown on me over the years. It's not one that stood out to me a lot when I first listened to the album, but there's something about the loneliness and desperation, again, in that song that have become all the more piercing to me over time.
And you compared it to a track on Elephant Eyelash.
Yeah, I kind of related it to the way that Gemini makes me feel in terms of just the swell of emotion in terms of loving someone else, a partner. Simeon's Dilemma is its pair, but in a one-sided way. Yeah. Which makes it even more
sad. Just straight up
sad. And just, again, like we said, you're the only proper noun I need. That line still makes me emotional. It still chokes me up at times.
Yeah. Like we said, one of the most, at least I think personally, one of the most important lines on the record. And the last track that I wanted to talk about is the actual last track on the record, Exegesis. I think that's how you say it. I'll just
I guess that is how you say it. I always said it wrong. So
how'd you say it?
No, I'm not going to say it.
Exegesis, I'm assuming. Because it's so clearly a finale, like of an album. It's so clearly the last song on an album, because he talks about all these horrible things that he's been talking about throughout the entire record. Faking suicide for applause in the food courts and malls. Murdering your ear hole shut with a rush of white coke. All these things about like how much he wants to die, or all these horrible situations that he's in. In Exegesis, he says, "If I really meant it, like if I meant all that stuff that I said."
Telephone wire with no poor boy's pile of books underfoot, no stack of yoga mats or phone cord cushion pads to lessen the pressure of the phone cord choke in my neck. If I really...
He says all that, and it's almost like Exegesis is almost like a suicide note, but he's like, if I really meant of what I was saying, this is exactly how I would do. This is what I would do. And it made me realize that in Elephant Eyelash and Mumps, both of those albums are their final tracks are focused on him dying or his death, or him,
But they're handled in completely different ways.
Exactly, and it's not something that I realized whenever I listen to Elephant Eyelash all the way through. It's not something that I realized whenever I listen to Mumps all the way through, because it's just like those two songs are in a much, I would say, brighter context than Alopecia is.
Or it's easier to ignore.
Yeah, exactly. But this one is just like so just in your face. Like I'm talking about death. I'm talking about my own fall or my own death. And at the end of Elephant Eyelash, where he says,
"When my balls are finally big enough to do it, I don't want no casket, no saddle. No see-through plastic mask."
I love that part where it switches.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great part.
And then at
the
the end of Mumps, he talks about, "I'll hold my own death as a card in the deck."
I'll hold my own death as a card in the deck to be played when there are no other cards left.
So those three albums, I think three of the most important albums, at least before, in our time, before McLean came out, three of the most important albums to us. Once again, not to do Eskimo Snow any disservice, ending in this idea of his death, or in the idea of like his finale. It's the strongest in Alopecia. Like you said, it was easier to kind of like forget in the context of the other two albums, but you can't look past this one on this record.
Can I talk a little bit about this song?
You please do.
Everything that you're saying is really interesting, because I almost feel a little bit different about it. I think it's one, I don't know if it's because the album that I had those two extra tracks, the remixes at the bottom, that Exegesis felt a little bit more like a transition piece to me. But even without those two remix tracks, Exegesis still sounds like a transition song to me, as opposed to an ending, because it's so cyclical and it fades in and fades out, and it's clearly implying that there is no beginning and no end, which is actually kind of similar to what I said about Moline earlier, how there's this kind of cycle, whereas on Alopecia it feels hopeless, like he's stuck. It's like when you have those same thoughts racing through your head and you just can't get out of this rut. But Moline is almost this contentment in a way.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and just the idea of, like you said, feeling stuck in this cycle of like just like suicidal thoughts.
Yeah, like what's the point?
Exactly. And then right after that, if you're listening to it on a record, just silence. Just like nothing else after that.
Or the beginning of the
exactly.
The
and if you're not listening to it on a record,
and
you got to
that's
start it all
just
over again.
as
Yeah. Just as
kind of frightening, kind of like I'm stuck,
Yeah, it's like I don't know which one I would prefer, if I would prefer the silence or the idea that I have to go through all of this self-realization again.
Yeah, well, it's great for us because the album's amazing.
Yeah, the album's incredible, and I don't have to relate to any of those
well.
experiences. But yeah, just an endless amount of words for every single one of these.
Was there anything else you wanted to talk about real fast?
Maybe just like some honorable mentions, or just like some quick
just
throwaway
real
facts.
quick.
28, obviously.
Oh yeah, we love 28.
He gives the old Lone Star State a shout out.
Yeah, he talks about Texas.
Yeah. I talked a little bit earlier. I kept saying that I was going to talk about this line, and I totally forgot to talk about it. In Follow Mr. Fifths, when he says that I never said I didn't have syphilis, Miss Listless.
I'd be upset. I never said I didn't have syphilis, Miss Listless. Hard like the bricks I pound my fists with. I mean, she's hard like the bricks that I pound with my fists.
There's a line in Cloud Dead's in a Themselves track that Cloud Dead was featured on, called "Rappin' for Money." Incredible song. He remixes it. Yoni remixes it for his old dope rap tape. So in the Fall of Mr. Fitz, he said, I never said I didn't have syphilis, Miss Listless. And in Rappin' for Money, he says, I'll rock my fake batch of syphilis, which is strictly for pity.
Isn't it? If it ain't dick to make, I'll rock my fake batch of syphilis, which is strictly for pity. But boy, it ain't pretty, the faux rash on my breastplate. I'd ask if this pays.
And so, like, we're talking about just like random throwaway things. I really want to know, like, something had to have happened for him to reference that line twice within 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
I gotta know, dude. I gotta know what it was.
It's so personal.
Yeah, but no. So yeah, that just being like and I've talked about why as a discography rather than each individual. Seeing how it all flows together from start to whenever he decides or they decide to finish. And how in A Sky for Shoeing Horses Under, the only clear indication that this and Eskimo Snow were recorded in the exact same session was he says A Sky for Shoeing Horses Under, and then in Eskimo Snow, in a track in Eskimo Snow, he says,
Looks like a sky for shoeing horses under. Looks like a sky of some kind.
But yeah, just like some A Sky for Shoeing Horses Under, I think is one of my, the same way that the Fall of Mr. Fifth is one of my favorite songs to just like sing along to. A Sky for Shoeing Horses Under is my favorite song to walk to.
Yeah.
It's like him walking. Yeah, exactly. In and out of the frame. So it's like I'm being put in that exact situation. Literally, like I will look down at the ground and like watch my shoes go in and out of my own frame.
When I'm eyed, I tongue my bottom teeth and look at the sidewalk in front of me as my tennis shoes go in and out of the frame. Another sleep-footed empty ride, walking on goose eggs in the mission.
Yeah. So, I mean, did you have any other honorable mentions?
I mean, I could just name all the other songs on the album.
Yeah, you want to just do that? No. So all we're gonna do is just listen to the rest of the album for the rest of the segment. If we keep talking, we're just gonna talk about every single track on this record. So thank you again to Noah and Gavin. I believe this segment is going to air separately from their When the Sun Sets East. So this will be a little bonus episode, which is probably good because we've been recording for a lot longer than we did last time. But yeah, thank you again to Noah and Gavin.
Yeah,
Thanks again
so
to the
much.
Arc of E network for having us on to where we can just literally sit down and yell at each other about why
No.
for an entire hour. This is going much more amicably than I thought it would be. I thought you and I would have a lot of disagreements
Really?
on this album. Yeah.
Huh.
But yeah, thank you again. Next week we'll be talking about Eskimo
Snow,
which is going to be very exciting because like you and I said, I don't think this album gets enough credit.
Yeah.
And throughout all of Y's discography, because I'm a huge fan of all of it, some of my favorite lyrics, some of the most important lyrics to me are in this record.
Or in Eskimo Snow?
Yes. So there's your little teaser for next week.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm
stay
excited.
tuned. And we'll see you next week.
Yeah.